The fluorescent lights of the coffee shop buzzed overhead as I stared at my laptop screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at the end of another rejected job application response. 28 years old, and here I was again, unemployed, living in a cramped studio apartment, surviving on instant ramen and whatever freelance graphic design work I could scrape together. My name is Sarah Chen, and if you asked anyone in my family, they'd tell you I was the definition of unfulfilled potential. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and I didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. The heavy footsteps, the confident stride, the way conversation seemed to pause slightly as he passed, my older brother Marcus had that effect on people. At 32, he commanded respect wherever he went. Corporate lawyer, six-figure salary, married to a successful pediatrician, living in a house that could fit 3 of my apartments. Everything I wasn't. Still playing on your computer, I see, Marcus said, sliding into the chair across from me without invitation. His tailored suit probably cost more than my rent, and his perfectly styled hair didn't have a strand out of place despite the October wind outside. He glanced at my screen before I could close the laptop. Another rejection letter? What a surprise. I forced myself to meet his eyes, those same dark brown ones we'd inherited from our mother, though his held a coldness that mine never could. It's called job hunting, Marcus. Some of us have to work for opportunities instead of having them handed to us. He laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Right, because my law degree from Harvard just materialized out of thin air. Because the 80-hour weeks I put in at the firm are just me playing around. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same expression he probably used on opposing counsel. Face it, Sarah. You're 28 years old with nothing to show for it. No career, no direction, no ambition. Mom and Dad are too polite to say it, but we all know you're never going to amount to anything. The words hit me like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. This wasn't the first time Marcus had delivered this particular speech, but today it felt different. Maybe it was the way the barista behind the counter had overheard and was now pretending to be very interested in cleaning the espresso machine. Maybe it was the fact that I'd spent the morning calculating whether I could afford both groceries and electricity this month. Or maybe it was the realization that some part of me was starting to believe him. You know what your problem is? Marcus continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. You live in this fantasy world where you think your little art projects are going to magically turn into something meaningful. But the real world doesn't work that way. The real world requires discipline, focus, and actual talent, not just wishful thinking. My hands clenched around my coffee cup, the ceramic warm against my suddenly cold fingers. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through it, the gesture casual and dismissive. Let's see, you dropped out of business school to pursue creative endeavors. You've been fired from 3 different graphic design firms for not being a team player. And now you're sitting in a coffee shop at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, pretending to look for work while probably scrolling through social media. Each item on his list was technically accurate, but the way he presented them stripped away all context, all nuance, all of the reasons and circumstances that had led to those decisions. In Marcus's version of events, I was simply a failure who made poor choices. In reality, I'd left business school because I was having panic attacks every day. I'd been let go from those firms because I refused to compromise my artistic integrity for corporate mediocrity. And yes, I was in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, but it was because I'd been up until 3 a.m. working on a freelance project that would barely cover my phone bill. You're 32 years old, Marcus, and you still feel the need to tear down your little sister to make yourself feel better. What does that say about you? His expression darkened, and for a moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been uncertainty or hurt. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I'm trying to help you, Sarah. Someone needs to give you a reality check before you waste the rest of your life chasing impossible dreams. My dreams aren't impossible. Really? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more aggressive than if he'd been shouting. Name one thing, just one thing, that you've ever successfully completed. One goal you've achieved, one promise you've kept to yourself, one time you've proven that you're capable of more than mediocrity. The silence stretched between us, filled with the ambient noise of the coffee shop, steam hissing from the machine, conversations murmuring at other tables, jazz music playing softly from speakers I couldn't see. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to list all the small victories and personal growth moments that Marcus couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I couldn't think of one major accomplishment that would impress him. Everything I'd done, the art exhibitions at local galleries, the positive feedback from freelance clients, the slow but steady improvement in my skills, all of it felt small and insignificant under his scrutiny. In his world of corporate achievements and measurable success, my victories were invisible. That's what I thought, Marcus said, standing up and straightening his tie. Look, I know you think I'm being cruel, but this is what tough love looks like. You need to accept reality and figure out how to make something of yourself before it's too late. Maybe consider going back to school for something practical, like accounting or nursing. Something with a clear career path and steady income. He paused at the edge of the table, looking down at me with what might have been pity. I'm having dinner with Mom and Dad this Sunday. They're going to ask about you, and I'd prefer not to have to make excuses for why their youngest daughter is still struggling to figure out her life at nearly 30. Try to have some good news to share by then. And with that, he walked away, leaving me sitting alone with my lukewarm coffee and the wreckage of my self-esteem. I watched him through the window as he climbed into his BMW and drove away, probably heading back to his corner office and his successful life, completely unaware of the earthquake he'd just triggered inside me. For the first time in years, something deep inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, exactly, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't hurt, though my chest ached with the familiar pain of his dismissal. It was something harder and more dangerous, a quiet, burning determination that I'd never felt before. Marcus wanted proof that I could accomplish something meaningful? Fine. I'd give him proof. But not in the way he expected, and certainly not in the timeline he'd set. Whatever I did, whatever I achieved, it would be so unexpected, so completely outside his narrow definition of success, that he'd never see it coming. I opened my laptop again, but this time I wasn't looking at job applications. This time, I was looking at possibilities. 3 days after the coffee shop confrontation, I found myself sitting in the public library, surrounded by business books and entrepreneurship guides that I'd never bothered to read before. The smell of old paper and worn binding filled my nostrils as I flipped through pages about startups, innovation, and success stories that seemed like fairy tales. But one story caught my attention, a woman who'd started a tech company from her garage and sold it for millions 5 years later. The idea that had been forming in my mind since Marcus's cruel words began to crystallize. I wasn't going to prove him wrong by following conventional paths like getting another corporate job or going back to school for accounting. I was going to do something so audacious, so completely unexpected, that it would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about me. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, dinner Sunday at 6. Marcus said you might have some good news to share? The passive-aggressive hope in her message made my stomach clench. Even she was buying into Marcus's narrative that I needed fixing. I closed the business book and opened my laptop, creating a new document titled Project Vindication. The name felt dramatic, but this whole situation called for drama. For the next 2 hours, I researched everything I could about mobile app development, online businesses, and digital marketing. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was my path forward. The idea itself was deceptively simple, a productivity app specifically designed for creative professionals. Every existing app I'd tried was built for corporate workers, all spreadsheets and rigid schedules that felt suffocating to someone like me. But what if there was an app that understood the chaotic, inspiration-driven way artists actually worked? Something that could track creative energy instead of just time, that could help freelancers manage the emotional roller coaster of creative work alongside the practical necessities? I started sketching interface designs on napkins, my excitement building with each rough wireframe. This wasn't just about proving Marcus wrong anymore, I could feel myself falling in love with the idea itself. The app could have mood tracking, inspiration boards, flexible scheduling that adapted to creative blocks and flow states. It could connect freelancers with each other, creating a community that understood the unique challenges of creative work. By the time the library closed at 9 p.m., I had filled 12 pages of notes and had the basic framework of what would become creative flow. But as I walked home through the empty streets, reality began to creep in. I knew nothing about app development. I had maybe $3,000 in savings. I didn't have a business plan, a development team, or any idea how to turn my sketches into actual code. The familiar voice of doubt, the one that sounded suspiciously like Marcus, whispered in my ear, "You're being ridiculous. You can't even hold down a regular job, and now you think you're going to build a successful app?" This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking that's kept you stuck for so long. I stopped walking and stood under a streetlight, watching my breath form clouds in the cold air. For a moment, I almost turned around and went back to the library to return all those business books and pretend this whole idea had never happened. It would be easier to stay small, to keep expecting little from myself so I'd never have to face the crushing disappointment of another failure. But then I remembered the look on Marcus's face in the coffee shop, that mixture of pity and superiority that had made me feel about 2 inches tall. I remembered his challenge to name one thing I'd ever successfully completed, and how I'd sat there speechless while he dismantled my confidence piece by piece. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. "Day 1 of Project Vindication," I said quietly, feeling slightly ridiculous but pushing through it anyway. "I'm going to build an app that will help creative professionals manage their work and their mental health. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out. And when I do, Marcus is going to eat every word he said to me." The next morning, I woke up before my alarm for the first time in months. I made actual breakfast instead of grabbing a granola bar, and I put on real clothes instead of yesterday's pajamas. The energy of having a concrete goal was intoxicating. I felt more alive than I had in years. I spent the day reaching out to every creative professional I knew, asking them about their biggest challenges with productivity and project management. The responses were immediate and passionate. Sarah Martinez, a photographer I'd worked with on a few projects, wrote back. "Within an hour, OMG yes. I've been looking for something like this forever. Every productivity app assumes I work 9 to 5 in an office, but sometimes I'm most creative at midnight or when I'm walking through the park. I need something that gets that." By the end of the week, I had conducted informal interviews with 23 different creative professionals, illustrators, writers, musicians, photographers, and graphic designers. The pattern was clear: everyone was frustrated with existing productivity tools that didn't understand the creative process. They wanted something that could handle irregular schedules, creative blocks, inspiration surges, and the emotional ups and downs that came with freelance creative work. I also learned that I wasn't the only one struggling. Nearly everyone I spoke with had dealt with imposter syndrome, irregular income, isolation, and the challenge of being taken seriously by family members who didn't understand creative careers. These conversations were validation that I wasn't alone in my struggles, but they also highlighted just how big the opportunity was. Sunday dinner arrived faster than I'd expected. I sat in my parents' dining room, the same room where Marcus and I had eaten countless family meals growing up, where he'd always been the golden child who got straight A's while I got lectures about applying myself. The chandelier cast the same warm light over the mahogany table, but everything felt different now. I had a secret that was burning inside me, begging to be shared. "So, Sarah," my father said, cutting into his pot roast with surgical precision, "Marcus mentioned you've been thinking about your career direction. Any updates?" I glanced at Marcus, who was watching me with that familiar mixture of skepticism and boredom. He probably expected me to announce that I'd applied for a receptionist position or signed up for a medical billing course. "Actually, yes. I'm working on a business idea." "Oh." My mother's voice carried a note of cautious optimism. "What kind of business?" "I'm developing a mobile app for creative professionals. It's a productivity tool specifically designed for people whose work doesn't fit into traditional corporate structures." I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. Marcus set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. An app? Sarah, do you have any idea how competitive the app market is? How much capital you'd need to develop and market something like that? The failure rate for new apps is astronomical. I've done my research, I said, meeting his gaze. There's a gap in the market for productivity tools that understand creative work patterns. I've already validated the concept with over 20 potential users. Validated the concept? Marcus's voice carried that familiar condescending tone. You mean you asked some of your artist friends if they liked your idea? That's not market research, Sarah. That's just wishful thinking disguised as business planning. The old me would have crumbled under his dismissal, would have started backpedaling and making excuses. But something had changed in me over the past week. The conversations with other creatives had shown me that my struggles weren't personal failings, they were systemic problems that affected an entire community of talented, hardworking people who deserved better tools and more respect. You're right that it's competitive, I said calmly. But that's because there's a huge market for productivity solutions. And you're also right that most apps fail. But most apps also try to be everything to everyone. I'm building something specifically for our underserved community that I'm part of and understand deeply. My father looked intrigued despite himself. Do you have any experience with app development? Not yet, but I'm learning. I've already started online courses in user experience design and project management. And I'm networking with developers who might be interested in collaborating. This last part was a slight exaggeration. I'd identified some potential collaborators through online forums, but I hadn't actually reached out to anyone yet. Still, it wasn't completely untrue. Marcus shook his head. This is exactly what I was talking about the other day. You get these grand ideas and you think enthusiasm is going to carry you through. But building an app requires technical skills, business acumen, marketing expertise, none of which you have. You're setting yourself up for another failure. Maybe, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. But maybe not. Either way, I'd rather fail at something I believe in than succeed at something that makes me miserable. The silence that followed was thick with tension. My parents exchanged glances across the table, probably wondering how their Sunday dinner had turned into a battlefield between their children. Marcus stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, his expression unreadable. Well, my mother said finally, her voice artificially bright, it sounds like you're really putting thought into this. That's wonderful, honey. But I could see it in their faces, the polite skepticism, the careful encouragement that didn't quite hide their doubt. They were humoring me, just like Marcus had predicted they would. In their minds, this was just another one of Sarah's phases, another creative project that would fizzle out when reality set in. As I drove home that night, I realized that I'd just made the situation exponentially more complicated. It was one thing to have a private goal of proving Marcus wrong. It was another thing entirely to announce that goal publicly and put my reputation on the line. Now my entire family was watching and waiting to see if I would follow through or flame out spectacularly. The pressure should have been paralyzing, but instead, it felt energizing. For the first time in years, I had something to fight for that was bigger than my own comfort or security. I wasn't just building an app anymore, I was building proof that Marcus was wrong about me, that my parents' quiet disappointment was unfounded, that I was capable of more than anyone believed. But as I pulled into my apartment complex and saw the stack of unpaid bills waiting on my kitchen counter, a new kind of doubt crept in. What if Marcus was right? What if this was just another elaborate form of procrastination, another way to avoid facing the hard truths about my life? What if I was about to fail more publicly and spectacularly than I ever had before? I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the glowing windows of my neighbors' apartments, wondering what it would feel like to have a normal, stable life where Sunday dinners didn't feel like performance reviews. But then I remembered the excitement in Sarah Martinez's voice when she'd described her frustrations with existing productivity apps, and the way 3 different illustrators had independently mentioned the same problems with tracking creative time. This wasn't just about proving Marcus wrong anymore. There were real people out there who needed what I was building, and that gave me something I'd never had before, a purpose that extended beyond my own insecurities and ambitions. Tomorrow, I would start learning to code. 6 weeks into my coding journey, I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep and an unhealthy amount of caffeine. My studio apartment had transformed into a war room, sticky notes covered every surface, whiteboards leaned against walls, and my coffee table groaned under the weight of programming books with titles like JavaScript for Beginners and Mobile App Development in 30 Days. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was living exactly the kind of chaotic, obsessive lifestyle that Marcus would use as evidence of my instability. But something magical was happening. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely absorbed in something that felt important. The app was taking shape, slowly but surely. I'd managed to create basic wireframes, learn enough HTML and CSS to build simple prototypes, and even connect with a developer named Jake through an online forum who was interested in collaborating on the project. Jake was everything I wasn't: methodical, experienced, and refreshingly practical. During our video calls, he'd listen patiently as I explained my vision for Creative Flow, then gently guide me towards solutions that were actually feasible for a startup with no funding. He'd agreed to work with me in exchange for equity in the company, which felt both thrilling and terrifying. Someone else believed in my idea enough to invest their time in it. I was in the middle of testing a new mood tracking feature when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach dropped. He never called unless something was wrong or he needed something from me. "Hey," I answered, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in my voice. "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you meet me for lunch tomorrow?" His tone was different than usual, less condescending, more serious. Almost concerned. "Is everything okay? Are Mom and Dad all right?" "They're fine. This is about you, actually. I've been hearing some things, and I think you're getting in over your head with this app idea." I sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "What do you mean, you've been hearing things?" "I have connections in the tech industry, Sarah. When my little sister starts telling people she's building the next big productivity app, word gets around. I've been doing some research, and what I've found is concerning." The condescension was creeping back into his voice, and I felt my defenses rising. "What kind of research? Did you know that 90% of startups fail within the first year? Did you know that the average cost to develop a professional quality mobile app is between $100,000 and $500,000? Did you know that there are already dozens of productivity apps on the market, many of them backed by millions in venture capital?" Each statistic felt like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm aware of the challenges, Marcus. But that doesn't mean—" "And did you know," he continued, his voice growing sharper, "that Mom called me yesterday in tears because she's worried you're having some kind of breakdown? She said you haven't returned her calls in 2 weeks, and when she drove by your apartment, all your lights were on at 3 in the morning." Guilt washed over me. I had been avoiding my parents' calls, partly because I was so absorbed in my work and partly because I dreaded having to give them progress reports that they wouldn't understand. And yes, I'd been keeping irregular hours, but that was because I was most productive late at night when the world was quiet and I could focus. "I'm not having a breakdown," I said. "I'm working hard on something important." "Sarah, listen to yourself. You're isolating yourself, you're not sleeping, you're obsessing over this project to the exclusion of everything else in your life. When Dad asked if you'd found any freelance work to pay your bills, you couldn't even remember the last time you'd looked for a paying gig." That hit close to home. I had been so focused on Creative Flow that I'd turned down several small freelance projects, telling myself that I needed to prioritize the app. But my savings were dwindling, and I'd already had to ask my landlord for an extension on rent. "Meet me tomorrow," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. "Let me explain what I've learned about the app market, and maybe we can figure out a more realistic path forward for you." After he hung up, I sat in the blue glow of my laptop screen, staring at the code I'd been working on. Suddenly, it looked like gibberish amateur-hour attempts at something that required years of professional experience. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was having a breakdown, disguised as entrepreneurial ambition. I called Jake, even though it was nearly midnight on the West Coast. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and concerned when he heard the shakiness in mine. "What's wrong, Sarah?" I told him about Marcus's call, about the statistics he'd thrown at me, about my parents' worry and my dwindling bank account. Jake listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. "You know what?" he said when I finished. "Your brother sounds like a classic pessimist who disguises his fear as wisdom. Yes, most startups fail. Yes, app development is expensive and competitive. But you know what else is true? Every successful app that exists today was built by someone who decided to try anyway. But what if he's right? What if I'm just deluding myself? Sarah, I've been working in tech for 8 years. I've seen a lot of app ideas, and most of them are either solutions looking for problems or attempts to copy existing successful apps. Your idea is different. You've identified a real need in a specific community, you've done user research, and you're approaching development thoughtfully. That puts you ahead of probably 70% of the startups I've encountered." His confidence in the project was reassuring, but it didn't solve the practical problems Marcus had raised. "What about the money? I can't afford to hire a full development team, and I can't expect you to work for free forever. We'll figure it out. There are ways to bootstrap app development, especially if you're willing to start small and iterate. We could launch with a basic version and use revenue to fund additional features. It's not the venture capital route, but it's a valid path." The next day, I met Marcus at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the waiters wore ties and the menu didn't list prices. He was already seated when I arrived, looking perfectly put together in his navy suit while I felt underdressed in jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. "You look tired," he said by way of greeting. "I've been working hard. That's what I want to talk about." He slid a folder across the table. "I've put together some information I think you should see." The folder contained printouts of articles about startup failures, statistics about app development costs, and a particularly brutal piece about the entrepreneurship delusion that was supposedly affecting millennials. Each page felt like a systematic dismantling of everything I'd been working toward. "I'm not trying to crush your dreams," Marcus said as I flipped through the documents. "I'm trying to save you from a very expensive mistake. Look, I know you think I don't understand creative work, but business is business. And the business reality is that you're competing against companies with teams of experienced developers, millions in funding, and years of market research. So I should just give up? I think you should be realistic about what success looks like. Maybe instead of trying to build your own app, you could join an existing company that's working in the space. Use your understanding of the creative community as a competitive advantage, but do it within a structure that has the resources to actually succeed." I looked around the restaurant, at the other diners in their business attire discussing deals and strategies with casual confidence. In this environment, Marcus's arguments seemed irrefutable. I was a broke graphic designer trying to compete with Stanford MBAs and Silicon Valley veterans. It did seem delusional when he put it that way. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping. "I talked to a friend who works at TechCrunch. He says there are already 3 well-funded apps in development that target creative professionals. One of them is being built by a team that includes former Apple employees and has backing from a major venture capital firm. They're planning to launch in 6 months." The news hit me like a physical blow. All my research, all my user interviews, all my late nights learning to code, and I was already behind competitors who had resources I couldn't even imagine. "I know this is hard to hear," Marcus continued, "but I'd rather you find out now than after you've spent months and thousands of dollars chasing something that's already been done better by people with more experience and resources." I closed the folder and looked at my brother, really looked at him. For the first time, I saw something besides condescension in his expression. There was genuine concern there, and maybe even a little sadness. In his mind, he was protecting me from inevitable disappointment. He thought he was being kind. You've never believed I could do anything meaningful, I said quietly. That's not true. Yes, it is. When I got into art school, you said I was wasting my time. When I started freelancing, you said I'd never make a living. When I told you about the app, you immediately started listing reasons why it would fail. You've never once said congratulations or good luck or I believe in you. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm trying to be realistic, Sarah. Someone has to be. No, you're trying to be right. There's a difference. I stood up, leaving the folder on the table. You know what? Maybe you are right. Maybe I will fail spectacularly. Maybe I'll lose what little money I have and end up back where I started. But at least I'll know I tried. Sarah, wait. But I was already walking away, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. As I pushed through the restaurant's heavy glass doors, I realized something important had just happened. For years, I'd let Marcus's skepticism infect my own confidence, had allowed his voice to become the dominant narrator in my head. But today, for the first time, I'd chosen to believe in myself instead of believing in his limitations. The walk home gave me time to think, and by the time I reached my apartment, my resolve had crystallized. Yes, there were competitors with more resources. Yes, the odds were stacked against me. But those competitors didn't have what I had, they didn't understand the creative community from the inside, didn't know what it felt like to struggle with imposter syndrome while trying to manage irregular income and creative blocks. I called Jake immediately. I just had lunch with my brother, I said without preamble. He showed me research about our competitors, told me about better funded teams that are building similar apps. He thinks I should quit. And what do you think? I think he might be right about the competition. But I also think that's exactly why we need to move faster and be smarter. We can't compete on resources, but we can compete on understanding our users and building something that actually solves their problems. Now you're talking like an entrepreneur, Jake said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. What do you want to do? I want to launch a beta version in 3 months. Something basic but functional that we can get into the hands of real users. I'd rather fail fast with a real product than succeed slowly with a perfect idea that never sees the light of day. That night, I worked until sunrise, fueled by a combination of spite, determination, and genuine excitement about the challenge ahead. Marcus had tried to scare me with statistics and competition, but he'd accidentally given me something more valuable, a deadline. If there really were well-funded competitors planning to launch in 6 months, then I had 6 months to prove that David could still beat Goliath with the right combination of heart, hustle, and understanding of the battlefield. The next morning, I started making a list of every creative professional I'd ever worked with, every artist I'd met at gallery openings, every freelancer who'd ever complained about productivity apps that didn't understand their workflow. It was time to turn my network into my secret weapon. Marcus thought he knew how this story would end, but he was about to learn that he'd been underestimating me for the last time. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after my confrontation with Marcus at the restaurant. I was hunched over my laptop, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code that controlled the mood tracking feature, when something clicked. Not just in the code, though that finally started working too, but in my understanding of what I was actually building. I'd been thinking about Creative Flow as a productivity app, but staring at the interface I'd just created, I realized it was something much more important. It wasn't just helping creative professionals manage their time, it was validating their entire way of working. Every feature I'd built, the irregular schedule tracker, the creative energy monitor, the project mood boards, sent the same message: your way of working is legitimate, valuable, and worthy of sophisticated tools. I called Jake immediately, forgetting that he was 3 hours behind me in California. Sarah? His voice was groggy but alert. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Jake, I just figured out what we're really building. I explained my realization, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. Jake listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, until I finally ran out of steam. You know what this means, he said when I finished. This isn't just a productivity app anymore. It's a platform. A community. We're not just helping people manage their work, we're helping them feel less alone in how they work. That conversation changed everything. Over the next week, we redesigned the entire user experience around the concept of validation and community. Instead of trying to make creative professionals more like traditional workers, we leaned into what made them different. The app would celebrate irregular schedules, honor creative blocks as necessary parts of the process, and connect users with others who understood their challenges. More importantly, I started talking about the app differently. Instead of apologetically explaining why creative professionals needed different tools, I confidently described a market of millions of freelancers, artists, and creative entrepreneurs who are underserved by existing productivity solutions. The shift in language reflected a shift in my own confidence, and people responded to it. The first real validation came from an unexpected source. I'd posted about creative flow in a freelancers' Facebook group, expecting maybe a few polite comments. Instead, the post exploded. Within 24 hours, it had received over 200 comments and been shared dozens of times. Creative professionals from around the world were describing their frustrations with existing tools and expressing excitement about what we were building. But the comment that stopped me in my tracks came from someone named Maria Santos. This is exactly what I've been looking for. I'm a UX designer at a Fortune 500 company, and even our internal productivity tools assume everyone works the same way. I'd love to beta test this and potentially discuss it with our innovation team. A Fortune 500 company was interested in creative flow. I read the comment 3 times before it sank in, then immediately reached out to Maria to set up a call. Maria turned out to be everything I'd hoped for in a user, articulate about her needs, experienced with productivity tools, and connected to decision-makers at large companies. During our video call, she explained that her company had been struggling to manage their growing team of creative contractors and freelancers using traditional project management software. The problem is that corporate tools are built around the assumption that work happens in linear, predictable ways, she said. But creative work is inherently chaotic. You might have a breakthrough at midnight or realize you need to completely change direction in the middle of a project. Most productivity apps treat that as a bug, but Creative Flow seems to treat it as a feature. By the end of the call, Maria had not only agreed to beta test the app but had also connected me with 2 other companies that might be interested in licensing Creative Flow for their creative teams. Suddenly, I wasn't just building an app for individual freelancers, I was potentially building a solution that companies would pay significant money to license. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had spent years telling me that my understanding of creative work was a liability, something that made me unemployable in the real world of business. But it turned out that this understanding was actually my greatest asset, the thing that allowed me to see opportunities that traditionally trained business people missed. I was in the middle of preparing a presentation for Maria's innovation team when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel my stomach drop when I saw it. "Hey," I answered, surprised by how calm I sounded. "Sarah, I owe you an apology." That was not what I'd expected to hear. "What?" "I've been thinking about our conversation at the restaurant, and I realized I was out of line. You're an adult, and you have the right to pursue whatever goals you want without your big brother trying to sabotage them." I sat down hard on my couch, processing this unexpected turn. "What brought this on?" "I mentioned your app to a colleague who works in venture capital, thinking he'd back up everything I'd told you. Had been struggling to manage their growing team of creative contractors and freelancers using traditional project management software. The problem is that corporate tools are built around the assumption that work happens in linear, predictable ways," she said. "But creative work is inherently chaotic. You might have a breakthrough at midnight or realize you need to completely change direction in the middle of a project. Most productivity apps treat that as a bug, but Creative Flow seems to treat it as a feature." By the end of the call, Maria had not only agreed to beta test the app but had also connected me with 2 other companies that might be interested in licensing Creative Flow for their creative teams. Suddenly, I wasn't just building an app for individual freelancers, I was potentially building a solution that companies would pay significant money to license. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had spent years telling me that my understanding of creative work was a liability, something that made me unemployable in the real world of business. But it turned out that this understanding was actually my greatest asset, the thing that allowed me to see opportunities that traditionally trained business people missed. I was in the middle of preparing a presentation for Maria's innovation team when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel my stomach drop when I saw it. "Hey," I answered, surprised by how calm I sounded. "Sarah, I owe you an apology." That was not what I'd expected to hear. "What?" "I've been thinking about our conversation at the restaurant, and I realized I was out of line. You're an adult, and you have the right to pursue whatever goals you want without your big brother trying to sabotage them." I sat down hard on my couch, processing this unexpected turn. "What brought this on?" "I mentioned your app to a colleague who works in venture capital, thinking he'd back up everything I'd told you about the competition and the odds of success. Instead, he asked me a bunch of questions about your market research and user validation process. When I described what you'd been doing, the interviews, the prototype testing, the community building, he said it sounded like you were following a pretty sophisticated lean startup methodology." Marcus paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "Sarah, I didn't even know what lean startup methodology was until he explained it to me. Apparently, some of the most successful apps in the world have been built using exactly the approach you've been taking. You've been doing real market research while I've been quoting general statistics that don't actually apply to your specific situation." I was quiet for a long moment, trying to process this admission. "So you think I might actually succeed?" "I think I don't know enough about your industry to make that judgment. But more importantly, I think you do know enough, and you've been making smart decisions that I didn't understand because I was too arrogant to listen." The apology felt good, but it also felt incomplete. "Marcus, this isn't just about the app. This is about how you've talked to me our entire lives. You've always acted like my way of thinking and working was somehow inferior to yours, like I needed to be fixed or managed or redirected toward more realistic goals." "You're right," he said quietly. "And I don't have a good excuse for that. I think I was scared that if I supported your unconventional choices and they didn't work out, I'd be partially responsible for your disappointment. It felt safer to be the voice of caution, even if it meant being discouraging. But that's not your job, Marcus. My failures are mine to own, just like my successes are mine to claim. I need you to be my brother, not my risk management consultant. I know. And I want to do better. Can you forgive me?" I looked around my apartment, at the whiteboards covered with user flow diagrams and the sticky notes mapping out feature prioritization. 3 months ago, this space had been a testament to my inability to commit to anything. Now it was mission control for something that might actually change people's lives. "I can forgive you," I said. "But I need you to understand that this isn't just about being more supportive. I need you to actually believe that I'm capable of building something meaningful. Not just hope that I am, but genuinely believe it." "I'm working on that," Marcus said. "And Sarah? I know this doesn't undo years of being a discouraging brother, but I'm proud of what you're building. Even if it doesn't succeed commercially, you've already proven that you can commit to something difficult and see it through. That's not nothing." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, processing the conversation. The apology was meaningful, but what struck me most was how little I needed it. 3 months ago, Marcus's approval had felt essential to my sense of self-worth. Now it felt nice to have, but not necessary. I'd found validation in user feedback, in Jake's partnership, in Maria's excitement about licensing opportunities. I'd discovered that the world was full of people who understood and valued what I brought to the table. That night, I video called my parents to give them an update on Creative Flow. Instead of the usual polite encouragement tinged with worry, they listened with genuine interest as I explained the beta testing process and the potential corporate partnerships. When I mentioned that a Fortune 500 company was interested in licensing the app, my father actually leaned forward and asked detailed questions about the business model. I have to admit, my mother said when I finished the update, I didn't really understand what you were building before, but this sounds like a real business opportunity. Are you going to need investors? The question surprised me. Maybe eventually, but Jake and I are trying to bootstrap as much as possible. We want to prove that people will actually pay for what we're building before we take on outside funding. Smart approach, my father nodded. Your mother and I have some savings sitting in low-interest accounts. If you ever need a small loan to cover development costs, we'd be happy to discuss it. I stared at the screen, processing this offer. 6 months ago, my parents had been diplomatically encouraging about my creative projects while clearly hoping I'd find something more stable. Now they were offering to invest in my startup. The transformation felt surreal. Thank you, I said, meaning it deeply. I'm not ready to take on investors yet, even family investors, but it means everything to know that you believe in what I'm building. After the call ended, I opened my laptop and looked at the beta version of Creative Flow. It wasn't perfect, there were bugs to fix and features to add, but it was real. It existed in the world, and real people were using it to manage their creative work. More importantly, it was mine. Not something I'd been hired to build for someone else's vision, but something that had emerged from my own understanding of a problem that mattered to me. The girl who had sat speechless in that coffee shop while Marcus dismantled her confidence was gone. In her place was someone who knew how to identify market opportunities, validate assumptions, build products, and navigate complex business relationships. I wasn't just proving Marcus wrong about my potential, I was discovering capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. But even as I celebrated this internal transformation, I knew the real test was still ahead. Beta testing was one thing, building a sustainable business was another. The next few months would determine whether Creative Flow was a genuine breakthrough or just a more sophisticated form of the same old pattern of starting projects I couldn't finish. The difference was that this time, I wasn't just hoping I could succeed. I was planning for it. Success, it turned out, brought its own set of problems. Within 6 weeks of launching the beta version of Creative Flow, we had over 500 active users and a waiting list of nearly 2,000 more. The Fortune 500 company Maria worked for had signed a pilot agreement worth $15,000, and 2 other corporations were seriously considering licensing deals. On paper, everything was going exactly as I'd hoped. In reality, I was drowning. The beta users were enthusiastic but demanding, sending detailed feedback reports that Jake and I struggled to prioritize and implement. The corporate clients wanted features that didn't exist yet and timelines that seemed impossible. My apartment had become a 24-hour office where I worked until I collapsed from exhaustion, then woke up to do it again. You need to hire help, Jake said during one of our daily video calls. He looked as tired as I felt, dark circles under his eyes from coding late into the night. We can't scale this as a 2-person operation. With what money? I asked, rubbing my temples where a headache had taken up permanent residence. The pilot program covers basic development costs, but not salaries. And I can't afford to pay anyone until we have more consistent revenue. It was the classic startup catch-22, we needed money to hire the people who could help us grow fast enough to make money. Meanwhile, every day we delayed implementing user requests was a day our competitors could get ahead of us. The stress was affecting every aspect of my life. I'd stopped returning calls from friends, missed 2 family dinners, and hadn't left my apartment for anything other than grocery runs in 3 weeks. My success story was starting to look suspiciously like the burnout narrative Marcus had predicted. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Maria called with what should have been great news. Sarah, my innovation team wants to move forward with a full licensing agreement, she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. They're talking about a 3-year contract worth potentially 6 figures annually. My heart should have been racing with excitement. Instead, I felt a wave of panic so intense that I had to sit down. That's incredible, I managed to say. What's the timeline? They want to roll it out to our entire creative team by the end of next quarter. That's about 200 users initially, with potential expansion to 500 plus if the pilot goes well. Can you handle that kind of scale? I looked around my apartment at the chaos of notes, wireframes, and empty coffee cups that represented my entire business infrastructure. Absolutely, I lied. Can you send me the detailed requirements? After we hung up, I stared at my laptop screen for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. This was the kind of opportunity that could transform creative flow from a promising startup into a real business. It was also the kind of opportunity that could destroy everything if I couldn't deliver on the promises I'd just made. I called Marcus without really thinking about it, needing to hear a familiar voice even if it came with criticism. "Hey," he answered, sounding pleased to hear from me. "How's the app empire coming along?" "It's complicated." I found myself explaining the licensing opportunity, the scaling challenges, and the growing pressure to deliver on promises that felt increasingly impossible to keep. Marcus listened without interrupting, a new habit he'd developed since our reconciliation. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, this sounds like a success problem, not a failure problem. Companies don't offer six-figure licensing deals to products that aren't working. But what if I can't deliver? What if I've oversold what we're capable of building? I keep thinking about what you said about the failure rate of startups, and wondering if I'm about to become one of those statistics." Okay, first of all, stop thinking about statistics and start thinking about solutions. You've proven that you can build something people want. Now you need to prove that you can build a business around it. Those are different skills, but they're both learnable. I was surprised by how practical and encouraging he sounded. The old Marcus would have said "I told you so" about the challenges I was facing. This version was trying to help me solve them. "What would you do if you were in my position?" I asked. "I'd probably panic for about a day, then I'd make a plan. You need capital to scale, right? Have you considered taking on investors?" The thought had occurred to me, but it felt like admitting defeat. I wanted to bootstrap as long as possible. Taking investor money means giving up control, and what if they don't understand the creative community the way I do? "Sarah, you're not giving up control by bringing in smart people who can help you grow. You're giving up control by trying to do everything yourself and burning out before you can capitalize on the opportunity you've created." That conversation haunted me for the rest of the week. I'd been so focused on proving I could succeed without help that I'd lost sight of what success actually looked like. Building a sustainable business wasn't about maintaining control over every detail, it was about creating something that could grow beyond what any one person could manage alone. Jake and I spent the following weekend researching funding options and putting together a basic pitch deck. The process forced us to articulate things we'd been taking for granted: our user acquisition costs, retention rates, and revenue projections. Seeing the numbers laid out systematically, I realized we actually had a much stronger business than I'd given us credit for. But the real revelation came when I started reaching out to potential investors. Instead of the skepticism I'd expected, I found genuine interest from people who understood the creative economy and saw the market opportunity we were addressing. A venture capital firm that specialized in B2B software agreed to meet with us, and their preliminary feedback was encouraging. "You've done exactly what we look for in early-stage companies," said Jennifer Walsh, the partner who led our initial call. "You've identified an underserved market, validated your solution with real users, and proven that customers will pay for what you're building. The question isn't whether there's an opportunity here, the question is whether you're ready to scale it aggressively." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I spent the entire weekend preparing. I practiced the pitch until I could deliver it in my sleep, researched comparable companies and market sizing data, and tried to anticipate every possible question they might ask. But on Monday night, doubt crept in again. I found myself staring at the pitch deck, wondering if I was about to make a huge mistake. Taking venture capital wasn't just about money, it was about committing to a growth trajectory that would fundamentally change what creative flow was and what my life looked like. I called my parents, something I'd been doing more often since our relationship had improved. I have a big investor meeting tomorrow, I told them. And I'm terrified. What are you afraid of? My mother asked. That they'll say no. That they'll say yes. That I'm not ready for what comes next. I paused, trying to articulate the deeper fear. That I'll succeed beyond what I can handle and end up destroying the thing I built. My father, who'd been quiet during most of the conversation, spoke up. Sarah, do you remember when you were 7 and you wanted to enter that art contest, but you were afraid your drawing wasn't good enough? I did remember. I'd worked on a watercolor painting for weeks, then hidden it in my closet because I was too scared to submit it. You told me that if you didn't enter, you'd definitely lose, but if you did enter, you might win. And that might win was better than definitely lose. This feels like the same situation. He was right. I'd spent so much energy worrying about potential failure that I'd almost forgotten why I'd started this journey in the first place. Not to play it safe, but to prove that I was capable of more than anyone believed, including myself. The investor meeting went better than I'd dared to hope. Jennifer and her team asked thoughtful questions about our user research, challenged us to think bigger about market opportunity, and offered strategic insights that showed they understood both the technical and business aspects of what we were building. At the end of the hour, Jennifer leaned forward and smiled. We'd like to move forward with due diligence for a Series A investment. Based on what we've seen today, we're thinking about a round that would give you the capital to hire a full development team, expand your feature set, and scale your sales efforts aggressively. Jake and I exchanged glances across the conference table. 6 months ago, I'd been an unemployed graphic designer sitting in a coffee shop while my brother dismantled my confidence. Now I was fielding offers from VCs who wanted to invest millions in the company I'd built from scratch. We're very interested, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. When can we start the formal process? As we walked out of the building, Jake shook his head in amazement. Did that really just happen? I think it did. I looked up at the San Francisco skyline, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility settling on my shoulders. Jake, are we really about to become a real company? We already are a real company, he said. Now we're about to become a big one. That night, I called Marcus to tell him about the meeting. A Series A round? He sounded genuinely impressed. Sarah, that's incredible. How much are they talking about investing? Potentially $2 to $3 million. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought we'd been disconnected. Marcus? Are you there? Yeah, I'm here. I'm proud of you, Sarah. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you were capable of. For the first time in our adult relationship, I felt like Marcus was seeing me clearly, not as his little sister who needed guidance and protection, but as an equal who had built something impressive through her own intelligence and determination. But as I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment, soon to be replaced by a real office with real employees, I felt a bittersweet pang of nostalgia for the simplicity of the early days. Success was wonderful, but it came with its own weight of expectations and responsibilities. The girl who had started this journey to prove her brother wrong was about to become the CEO of a venture-backed startup. I just hoped I was ready for everything that came next. The crisis began with a single email that arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday, 3 weeks into the due diligence process with Jennifer's VC firm. I was working late in the small office space Jake and I had rented, trying to prepare financial projections for the investment committee, when my phone buzzed with a message from Maria. Sarah, we need to talk first thing Monday morning. There's been a development with our licensing agreement that I need to discuss with you urgently. My stomach dropped. In startup land, urgent Sunday night emails rarely brought good news. I tried calling Maria immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. I spent the rest of the night alternating between catastrophic thinking and forcing myself to focus on spreadsheets, achieving neither peace of mind nor productive work. Monday morning's call confirmed my worst fears. I'm so sorry, Sarah, Maria said, her voice tight with stress. Our company just announced a major acquisition of a productivity software firm. The integration is going to take priority over all new vendor relationships for the next 18 months. Our legal team has advised us to pause any new licensing agreements until the merger is complete. The numbers started spinning in my head. The corporate licensing deal had been worth $180,000 annually, money we'd already factored into our growth projections and investor pitch. More importantly, it had been our proof of concept that large companies would pay for creative flow. Without it, our entire business model looked far less convincing. Is there any possibility of moving forward on a smaller scale? I asked, trying to keep desperation out of my voice. I've asked, but the directive came from the C-suite. All new vendor relationships are frozen. I feel terrible about this, especially knowing how much you've been counting on this partnership. After the call ended, I sat in my empty office staring at the whiteboard where we'd mapped out our 6-month growth plan. Every milestone, every hiring decision, every feature development priority had been built around the assumption that corporate revenue would provide a stable foundation for growth. Now that foundation had just crumbled. I called Jake immediately. "How bad is this?" he asked after I explained the situation. "Bad. Without the corporate revenue, our numbers don't support the valuation we've been discussing with investors. And if word gets out that our biggest client just canceled, it's going to raise questions about the viability of our business model. Do we tell Jennifer right away, or do we try to find replacement revenue first?" It was the question I'd been dreading. Ethically, we needed to inform our potential investors about the change immediately. Practically, doing so would probably kill the funding round and potentially the entire company. "We tell her today," I said finally. "If we're going to fail, I'd rather fail honestly." The call with Jennifer was as painful as I'd expected. She listened calmly as I explained the situation, asked a few clarifying questions, then delivered the verdict with professional kindness. "Sarah, I appreciate your transparency in bringing this to us immediately. Unfortunately, the loss of your anchor client does significantly change our risk assessment. We're going to need to put the investment process on hold until you can demonstrate replacement revenue or a clear path to sustainable growth without corporate licensing." "How long of a hold?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That depends on how quickly you can rebuild your revenue projections." Without wanting to be discouraging, I'd estimate at least 6 months before we could reconsider, assuming you're able to replace the lost revenue with something equally stable. 6 months. In startup time, that might as well have been 6 years. Our current runway would last maybe 3 months without additional funding, and that was assuming we didn't hire anyone new or invest in marketing. We were looking at a choice between dramatically scaling back our ambitions or running out of money entirely. After hanging up, I put my head down on my desk and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes of self-pity. Then I started making a list of everyone who had ever expressed interest in creative flow, trying to find a path forward that didn't involve complete failure. The next 2 weeks were a blur of desperate sales calls, hastily arranged demos, and increasingly creative attempts to generate revenue. I reached out to every beta user who had shown enthusiasm, pitched individual licensing deals to smaller companies, and even considered pivoting to a consulting model where we'd help companies implement productivity systems rather than licensing our software. Nothing worked. The individual users loved Creative Flow but weren't willing to pay enough to sustain a business. The smaller companies were interested but wanted extensive customization that would require resources we didn't have. The consulting pivot felt like admitting defeat and abandoning everything that made our solution unique. Worse than the business challenges was the growing realization that I was failing the people who had believed in me. Jake had turned down job offers to work on Creative Flow full-time. My parents had started telling their friends about their entrepreneur daughter. Marcus had begun introducing me as his sister who's building the next big productivity app instead of his sister who's still figuring things out. The weight of their expectations felt heavier than my own disappointment. I was in the middle of another fruitless sales call when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, I didn't want to answer. I wasn't ready to explain that the success story he'd finally started believing in was falling apart. "Hey," I answered, trying to sound normal. "Sarah, I just heard about the licensing deal falling through. Maria's company announced the acquisition in TechCrunch this morning." My heart sank. If the news was already public, it would be impossible to find replacement investors who didn't know about our setback. "Yeah, it's been a challenging couple of weeks. How are you holding up?" The genuine concern in his voice was almost my undoing. For years, I'd resented Marcus's lack of faith in my abilities. Now that he finally believed in me, I was about to prove that his original skepticism had been justified all along. "I'm trying to figure out next steps," I said carefully. "There are always pivots and adjustments in startup life. Sarah, you don't have to put on a brave face for me. This is a real setback, and it's okay to be upset about it." Permission to be vulnerable from Marcus, of all people, broke something loose inside me. "I think I might have to shut down the company," I said quietly. "Without that corporate revenue, we can't afford to keep developing the product or hire the people we need to scale. And no investor is going to fund us after losing our biggest client. Have you considered going back to the individual user market? Charging subscription fees directly to freelancers and creative professionals? The numbers don't work. Individual users aren't willing to pay enough to cover development costs, especially not at the scale we'd need to be sustainable." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What if you didn't need to be profitable immediately? What if you could find a way to sustain the company while you built up the individual user base over a longer timeline? That would require funding that we can't get, or revenue that doesn't exist. Or it would require lowering your overhead and extending your runway until you could prove the individual model works." I knew what he was suggesting: laying off employees I hadn't even hired yet, moving back to my apartment office, going back to the scrappy bootstrap approach that had gotten us this far. It felt like admitting failure, but it might be the only way to avoid actual failure. "You're talking about basically starting over," I said. "I'm talking about getting back to what was working before you tried to scale too quickly. Sarah, you built something that people genuinely want. That doesn't change just because one corporate client backed out. Maybe you were trying to grow too fast because you thought that's what success looked like." His words hit harder than I'd expected. Had I lost sight of why I'd started Creative Flow in the first place? I'd begun this journey to prove that I could build something meaningful, not to become a venture-backed startup CEO. Somewhere along the way, I'd started measuring success by external metrics, investor interest, corporate clients, growth rates, instead of the internal satisfaction of solving problems that mattered to me. That night, I sat in my empty office and wrote down every reason I'd originally wanted to build Creative Flow. The list filled 2 pages: helping creative professionals feel less alone, validating unconventional work styles, providing tools that actually understood artistic processes, building a community of people who supported each other's creative journeys. None of those reasons required venture capital or corporate licensing deals. They required commitment, creativity, and a willingness to grow slowly and sustainably rather than chase the startup dream of explosive growth. I called Jake at midnight. "I think we've been building the wrong company," I said without preamble. The Adobe partnership was just the latest validation of what Creative Flow had become. Our user base had grown to 25,000 active subscribers, we'd expanded our team to 8 people, and most importantly, we'd maintained the community-first culture that made the app genuinely useful rather than just commercially successful. But the real measure of how far I'd come wasn't in business metrics, it was in how I'd learned to navigate the complex emotional landscape of entrepreneurship while staying grounded in my own values and relationships. Marcus's transformation had been as remarkable as my own. 3 months after our New Year's conversation, he'd taken the position at the nonprofit law clinic, accepting a 60% pay cut to do work that aligned with his values. The last time we'd talked, he'd been glowing with enthusiasm about a case involving housing rights for low-income families. I had no idea how much energy I was spending on work that felt meaningless, he'd told me during our weekly phone call. Now I wake up actually excited about what I'm going to accomplish that day. His marriage had struggled initially with the financial adjustment, but ultimately his wife had supported the change when she saw how much happier he'd become. They downsized their house, simplified their lifestyle, and discovered that they actually enjoyed each other's company more when Marcus wasn't constantly stressed about billable hours and partnership tracks. "You know what's funny?" Marcus had said during that same conversation. "I spent years telling you to be more practical and realistic, but you're the one who taught me that there's nothing practical about spending your life doing work that doesn't matter to you." My parents had undergone their own evolution as they watched both their children pursue more authentic paths. My father had started volunteering as a mentor for young entrepreneurs, drawing on his business experience to help people build sustainable companies. My mother had returned to painting, a passion she'd abandoned decades earlier to focus on raising us. "Watching you two figure out what really matters has made us think about our own choices," she'd said during a recent visit. "We're proud of your professional success, but we're even more proud of how you've stayed true to yourselves throughout the process." The most profound shift, though, had been in my relationship with myself. The voice in my head that had once sounded like Marcus's criticism had been replaced by something much kinder and more constructive. When challenges arose, difficult users, technical problems, business decisions, I approached them from a place of curiosity rather than self-doubt. I'd also learned to celebrate achievements in ways that felt meaningful rather than performative. When Creative Flow hit 20,000 users, instead of posting about it on social media or calling investors, I'd organized a virtual party for our user community, complete with user-generated testimonials and feature requests. The celebration had been focused on the people we served rather than the milestone we'd achieved. That evening, as I sat in my home office responding to user emails, I came across a message that perfectly captured why all the struggle had been worth it. "Hi Sarah," wrote Maria Gonzalez, a freelance graphic designer from Mexico City. "I wanted to thank you for building Creative Flow. I've been freelancing for 5 years, and I've always struggled with feeling like my irregular work schedule meant I was unprofessional or disorganized. Your app helped me realize that my creative energy follows its own rhythm, and that's not a flaw to fix, it's a strength to work with. For the first time, I have data showing that my most productive hours are between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., and I've been able to restructure my client relationships around that reality. I'm earning more money, producing better work, and feeling less stressed about my career. You've given me permission to work the way that actually works for me." I read the email 3 times, each time feeling more grateful for the journey that had led me to this moment. Maria's experience was being replicated thousands of times over by creative professionals who were using Creative Flow not just to manage their work, but to validate their entire approach to creative life. I called my parents to share Maria's email and caught them in the middle of preparing dinner together, something they'd started doing more often since Marcus and I had begun living more intentionally. "That's wonderful, honey," my mother said after I read them Maria's message. "It sounds like you've built something that really changes people's lives." "I think I have," I replied, feeling the truth of that statement settle into my bones. "But more importantly, I've learned that building something meaningful is possible if you're willing to define success by your own standards rather than other people's expectations." My father, ever practical but increasingly wise, added, "The best businesses solve real problems for real people." It sounds like you've done that while also solving some important problems for yourself. That night, I started writing what would become my most personal blog post yet, reflecting on the 18-month journey from unemployed graphic designer to successful entrepreneur. But more than a business success story, it was a meditation on the courage required to trust your own vision when everyone around you is offering different definitions of what your life should look like. "The most unexpected thing about proving my brother wrong," I wrote, "was discovering that I'd been wrong about what needed proving. I thought I needed to demonstrate my competence to gain his respect. What I actually needed to do was learn to respect myself enough to stop seeking his approval." The post went on to explore the difference between external validation and internal satisfaction, the importance of building communities around shared values rather than just shared interests, and the radical act of choosing slow, sustainable growth over rapid scaling when that approach better serves your mission. But the heart of the post was a simple message: your unconventional approach to work and life isn't a problem to be solved, it's a strength to be leveraged. The world needs what you have to offer, but only if you're brave enough to offer it authentically. The response to the post was immediate and overwhelming. Creative professionals from around the world shared their own stories of family members who didn't understand their career choices, their struggles with productivity systems that felt alienating, and their gratitude for tools and communities that validated their way of working. More importantly, I started hearing from people who were inspired to pursue their own authentic paths after reading about my journey. A software engineer wrote about leaving his corporate job to build apps for social causes. A marketing professional shared her decision to specialize in working with nonprofits rather than chasing higher-paying corporate clients. A lawyer mentioned that he was considering transitioning to environmental law despite the financial implications. Each message reinforced the lesson I'd learned through building creative flow: when you have the courage to live authentically, you give other people permission to do the same. As I finished responding to emails and preparing for bed, I reflected on how different my life looked now compared to 18 months earlier. The external changes were obvious: profitable business, team of collaborators, industry recognition, improved family relationships. But the internal changes were even more significant. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of inadequacy, and to measure progress by impact rather than approval. Most importantly, I'd discovered that the person I'd always had the potential to become was someone worth fighting for. The girl who had sat speechless in that coffee shop while her brother dismissed her dreams was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly what she was building and why it mattered. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment of doubt and struggle. Creative flow was succeeding because I'd finally learned to succeed as myself. 2 years to the day after that devastating conversation in the coffee shop, I found myself back in the same cafe, sitting at the same table, but everything else had changed. Instead of a rejection letter on my laptop screen, there was a draft of my keynote speech for Creative Con, the first conference specifically designed for creative professionals who wanted to build sustainable, independent careers. The conference had grown out of our Creative Flow community, where users had repeatedly expressed a desire to connect in person and learn from each other's experiences. What started as a small meetup idea had evolved into a 3-day event with 500 attendees, featuring workshops on everything from pricing freelance work to managing creative burnout. Adobe was sponsoring the event, and I'd been invited to give the opening keynote about building businesses that honor creative work styles. I was reviewing my speech notes when someone slid into the chair across from me. I looked up to see Marcus, holding 2 coffee cups and wearing a smile